It's my very great pleasure to be chairing this session on, quote, programmatic specificity we can believe in. Or perhaps, as the Prime Minister who coined those immortal words might have put it, can I say, in relation to the question of DPS compliance, let me be quite clear that when it comes to working families, the government is committed to developing some form of conceptual synthesis in order to deliver a fair shake of the sauce bottle to the mums and dads of Australia, mate. If only that were an exaggeration. But in short, must Australia be resigned to a fate of awful officialese and brain-dumbing cliché from our politicians? After all, the Americans have just traded a leader who asked, "Is our children learning?" and then demanded that we not misunderestimate him, for a leader who has rediscovered rhetorical sentence structures and insisted, "Yes, we can." But can we? And even if we do, is soaring rhetoric any better for democracy than bureaucraties? Or are they both ultimately about shaping public perceptions purely for the benefit of politicians? Are we likely only to conclude, as our aspiring Prime Minister Tony Abbott once did in Parliament, it's very clear, I think, from the totality of the opposition's question and the totality of the Prime Minister's answer, exactly what the context of the answer was? Well, to tackle the context of the answer today are former New South Wales Premier Nathan Rees, political journalist extraordinaire Annabelle Crabb, and that one-man transatlantic institution, Christopher Hitchens. Each of our panellists will speak for 10 minutes or a shade under 10 minutes, after which we'll have some general discussion and open up the floor to your questions. Final housekeeping, of course. Everyone, please turn off your mobile phones before we begin. Anyone caught letting their mobile ring will be immediately subjected to an unending loop of the collected clichés of Peter Costello. But let's begin with a man who is anything but a cliché. Former New South Wales Premier Nathan Rees, whose genuine interest in clear language is perhaps no better demonstrated by the fact that he's no longer Premier. Now, I first met Nathan at the Premier's Literary Awards last year, the kind of function where Premiers swan in, present some cheques and swan out. But to the horror of his minders, Nathan not only didn't swan out, but he walked around the room and started to talk to people at every table. Even more worrisome for the apparatchiks was that the conversation was both engaging and unambiguous. Before they could whisk him off for a quick injection of jargon and cliché, he bumped into the Plain English Foundation table and said, "Plain English, do I need to talk to you?" But he did more than just talk. In no time at all, he'd announced he was issuing a memo to all New South Wales public servants mandating plain English as the standard for all communications with the public. Of course, this radical and revolutionary idea was so radical and revolutionary that within weeks he was no longer Premier. But surely that is just a coincidence. Please join me in welcoming our former Premier, Nathan Rees.
I assume that mic's working. Okay. Firstly, thank you, Neil, for that opening, and also thank you for the work. It's good to be here. Look, a couple of observations I would make at the outset, and the first is I think it's important to make distinctions between the tiers of government you're talking about when we're talking about language and communication more broadly. For state government in a jurisdiction like Australia, you're not sending people to war, unless you're talking about a war on drugs perhaps, but you're not making the sorts of decisions that an Obama or a head of state at a national level has to make. The truth is that state government and the activities therein are actually pretty mundane. You've got to make sure that the lights go on when you flip the switch. You've got to make sure that water comes out of the tap and the trains run on time and all those sorts of things that many of you are familiar with. Incidentally, for those of you who are from interstate or internationally, welcome to Sydney and welcome to Australia. But that's the reality, that the vast bulk of activity at a state government jurisdiction happens beneath the radar, and despite the demands of our friends in the fourth estate each day, you're not actually doing earth-shattering things every day. You're making sure, wherever you can, to the best of your ability, that the basic services are being delivered. If, for example, we've talked about the soaring rhetoric of the Obamas and so on, I hazard a guess that if an Australian politician sought to deliver one of those Obama-like speeches in Australia, they'd be booed off the stage. And I think there's a number of cultural and historical reasons for that, but we might touch on those later on. But Neil's point around plain language in government and plain language in communication, plain language in government departments, I think is an important one. And it's important for a number of reasons. My staff used to tear their hair out in despair when I'd be sending speeches or media releases back and saying, look, we don't use words like innovative, we don't use words like strategy, we don't use... If someone bowls up capacity building to me again, I'm going to vomit. And I'd keep sending these things back, and eventually saw Neil and prompted that memo, which I'm certain has fixed everything. But it's not just governments that do this, it's the corporates do it. Anyone in this room who's picked up an annual report or a glossy brochure from a corporate will see that the language used is just appalling. If we read these things, and you have to read them again and again to try to distill any of the content or meaning at all. And the important part of this, for mine, is that the more obscure the language is that we use as politicians, as opinion leaders, as international figures, and as media reporters, the more obscure that language is, the more people you're locking out of appropriate policy debates. Now, I think that matters. I think it matters for the health of democracy. I think it matters for, dare I say it, social inclusion. And I think it matters for the quality of public policy debate and the democracy in general. So that's what motivates me towards a plain English approach to things. Many of you in this room will have read Orwell's essays on these matters, and he himself at the time writes that we all succumb to these phrases on occasion. That's not the point. The point is to be aware when we're using language that isn't accurate, that doesn't portray things in as simple and as clear a fashion as we might be able to. So that's what motivates me with regards plain language. I guess where it becomes difficult is when you're standing up in front of a media throng each day generally, and you're having questions fired at you from a metre away, and there's cameras thrust in your face and so on. And we saw Tony Abbott this week, and I felt some sympathy with Abbott on the 7:30 report. But true. But the reality is that in politics, and you might disagree with this, but I've got rock-solid examples to point to, the treatment of political leaders goes like that by the media. Sometimes, I used to sit next to Kevin in press conferences in the early days of his Prime Ministership in Canberra, and I'd be sitting there and there'd be very respectful media pack. And I'd be sitting there thinking, there is no way in the world I would get away with that in Sydney. And subsequent to that, Kevin now cops a hard time from the media pack down there as well. But what it means is that for our political leaders, there is no room for equivocation in your remarks. There is simply no room for error. There's certainly no room for whimsy. If you do, you run the very real risk of being smashed mercilessly for it. Now, to the eternal frustration of my staff, they would try to get me to stick to the script, and too often I departed from it. They'd have to mop up for the next couple of days. But, and I'm sorry if any of you are in the room, but that's where it gets difficult. Ultimately, I don't... there's a great deal of research being done on this sort of thing, how many thousands of messages people get bombarded with each day, that if you're trying to penetrate with a critical government message, it's very difficult. But whether it's Twitter, the internet, the print media, the television media, whatever it might be, I just don't see an option in the longer term other than seeking to be authentic, because I think people understand it when you're authentic. I think they understand that you're being genuine, even if you're getting it wrong. And I think I'm happy to be scrutinised by the public as I am by the media in the former role. But I think the Australian public understand that media treatment of political leaders also, on occasion, leaves a little bit to be desired. No, I'm not. No, I'm not having. Please understand, I'm not having a dig at Annabelle and Christopher. It's a generic comment around the quality of public policy debate we have in Australia.
Have a dig by all means.
Yeah, exactly. You may be surprised to hear that I agree with you in some of what you said. I do think that there is something odd about this field in Australia. I think that, words are the stock in trade of the politician. I mean, words are all, in the end, that a politician has to bring an audience along with him or her. And the thing that amazes me in this country is that so many of them are so incredibly bad at it. I mean, we endure incompetence in this field completely unblinkingly. Now, if you're a mechanic turned up to service your car armed with a banana, you'd be kind of quite reasonably suspicious about it. But we not only tolerate but expect our politicians to speak in gibberish. We expect ministers to line up at the dispatch box in question time and dully read out this turgid prose. We expect to get halfway through a Kevin Rudd speech and find our thoughts turning to self-harm and whether the iron's been left on. I mean, I've thought about some very unusual things during question time. And we don't kind of expect any different. And the other unusual thing about Australia, I think, often is the incredible suspicion that attaches itself to politicians who try to get any better at it. The suspicion that attaches to politicians that employ speechwriters is quite unusual. There's something kind of shameful in Australia about employing a speechwriter. There's something secretive about it. And it's often a bit of a bloke problem, I think. I never really notice it so much in female politicians, but Australian male politicians are usually about as comfortable admitting that they use a speechwriter as they might be admitting that they use hand cream or something, And I think it's probably not an accident that our last Prime Minister, I think, who was probably a recognised orator of any kind, was Keating, whose use of speechwriters was viewed, I think, in the game with sort of the same sort of suspicion as his affection for French clocks. Anyway, I mean, the speechwriters is a tough gig in politics at the moment. Kevin Rudd does have one, incidentally. I've met him. He seems like a completely well-balanced man, which is, not the Prozac-infused wreck you would kind of expect. But the thing about politicians is that they kind of, in terms of language, they fall roughly into different groupings, and they're kind of readily identifiable. My favourite by a long shot, and they do tend to be public darlings, is the ones that I call the bunglers. And these are the people for whom the English language is just this minefield. It's a sort of vast expanse of unexploded ordnance through which they tiptoe, fearing the worst. Barnaby, well, and of course the international gold standard is George Bush the Younger, and as we sit here, we're only about 500 metres away from the place where in 2007 at the APEC conference he made a small and gracious speech thanking Austria for its hospitality. And I'm not going to run you through Bushisms because there's billions of them and they're all in books called things like, why the French don't have a word for entrepreneur and that sort of thing. I did want to share some offerings from the UK's undisputed champion of bungle, John Prescott. Now, he is fabulous. Obviously, departed the scene now, but he is the man who, on landing at Heathrow after having a bad flight, said at a press conference, "It's great to be back on terracotta." Or sometimes the bungler's language is so opulently bizarre that it actually starts to make some sort of sense. And this one is a particularly good one for that. Prescott, making an observation on John Major's government just before they won power, said, here we have a government disintegrating between our eyes. Which is terrific. So anyway, and we've got Australian practitioners of this art, of course, Joe Bjelke-Petersen being the best known example, although there is a very competitive young contender from the Victorian Senate, from Victoria. Steve Fielding is rocketing up the ranks, I think, on that count. Then you have the orators who I'd call the meat and three veg people, like John Howard, who was never particularly flashy, never particularly ornate, and had only occasional fixations with words like the word mateship, which he sort of carried around, in his pocket like a treasured possession that popped up every now and again. But otherwise, meat and three veg. And then, of course, you have the Sorers, the Obamas and the Keatings and so on. But the very worst kind of political orator, I think, is the one that I call the extruder. Now, the extruder is a politician who has, in his or her head, a collection of grey, meaningless pieces of jargon that, when the time comes to fill a silence in the course of an interview or a speech or even a social conversation, will simply squirt out a selection of these words sufficient to fill the silence. And the thing about the extruder is that it's kind of like the oratorical equivalent of luncheon meat or something. It's mainly bulking agent, and the other fascinating thing about it is that the phrases can often be rearranged without making any difference at all to the meaning of the sentence. And I've got an example from Kevin Rudd, which is terrific. I went to the Labor conference last year. It was the most unremittingly tedious event I've ever attended. Were you there or were you hiding?
No,
you were. Marvellous, wasn't it? And he said, he was, in the course of this speech, he was praising all of the asylum seeker activists within the ALP that he was shortly to disappoint so profoundly, and praising the battles that have been fought at Labor conferences past over this issue, although he was gently allowing it to be intuited that no such behaviour would be tolerated these days. He said, where is it? He said, "Those resolutions represented the consistency of our purpose, the conviction of our resolve," which sounded, perfectly passionate until you realised you could actually rearrange all of those clauses and say, "Those convictions represented the purpose of our resolve, the resolution of our consistency." Language is only this malleable when it means absolutely nothing. And the way to spot the extruder, by the way, is there's all sorts of buzzwords. Rollouts, particularly the rollouts of things that are not round. That's a very popular one. The task forces and so on, and particularly the partnering. There's a lot of partnering in an extruder speech. There's more partnerings than a night out at Ken's of Kensington, to add a contemporary reference. Anyway, I'm just blathering on now, aren't I? I do think one of the... nothing is actually attempted by this language. It's risk-free language for a politician because it doesn't offer anything. It serves to obscure or to mark time rather than to reveal. Yeah, it doesn't commit the speaker to anything at all. And if you look at someone like Kevin Rudd, you know, what's got him into trouble in the last little bit is the clarity of his language early on climate change. You know, that's to have committed himself through language that was clear to something and then to disappoint, I suppose, is what's got him in difficulty. So it's hardly surprising that instead you hear him saying things like, and I've got a brilliant little piece from some overseas trip that he did a year or two ago, talking about, about climate change. There has to be a greater synergy between, let's call it our policy leadership in this, which has been focused so much legitimately on targets and global architecture, almost reverse engineered back to the means by which you can quickly deliver outcomes. And on the demand side in our economy, we're looking at potential advances in terms of 20 to 25% range if you do this across the board. It all takes cost, but let me tell you, it's probably the quickest lever you can pull given the challenges we face. That's rightly. Or, there are dozens of sticking points on the Doha round right now. Let's just be blunt about it. But where it was before, which was in a pre-glacial position, we're now moving rapidly down the glacier, okay? Except, unlike moving most glaciers, we have 5 weeks to arrive at the end point. You know, it's going to take a bit more to gelignite this thing into gear. But given where things were frozen up until last time. Anyway. The one thing that I'll say about soaring rhetoric, which is always much kinder on the ears, is that it is also anti-democratic in tendency to an extent, in the sense that its pure effectiveness is to disconnect the listener from his or her natural viewpoint. It's to seduce people away from their natural opinion. So there's an element to which fine rhetoric is anti-democratic in nature as well. Now, I know which I'd prefer, whether it's being seduced by a psychopathic orator who happens to be brilliant with language, or bored into submission by someone who has no idea how to use it. But then again, I would say that because I'm a journalist.
Beautiful.
I'm glad that somebody else is also a fan of Steel Fielding's. My favourite of his is, I will go into bat for my fellow Australians who are going to fall off the cliff. I am torn between two places and a hard rock. Now, speaking of being torn between two places and a hard rock, it's my pleasure to... Well, how do you introduce a man like Christopher Hitchens? Welcome to Australia, Hitch.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
Really, words like prolific get cast around with these days, but in Hitch's case, it's really a word that's hard to go past, given the range and scale of the papers that he's written for, the books that he's written, and the experiences that he's had, the commitment to his journalism. And the three examples that I think best typify that for me: writing about torture, submitted himself to waterboarding to see what it was like. Doing an article, submitted himself to Brazilian waxing.
Rougher.
It was a full Brazilian, wasn't it?
That was rougher.
Yes.
Because if you need to rip, you have to grip.
And perhaps...
Much worse than for ladies.
The worst torture of all, being smacked on the bum by former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Please welcome Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you. Well, I'm rather sad to find that the weed of langue de bois has spread to Australia. I always used to think of Australia as a country where men were men, sheep were nervous, plain speech, the spade was a bloody shovel. It was a relief often to go on ABC from Washington after the terrible drool in which the nation's capital is so frequently drowned. It put me in mind when I was listening to you of a Harold Pinter-esque monologue about the public lavatory attendant. I don't know if I can render it into Australia. I probably can. the attendant is doing a monologue speaking about his woes, the difficulties of the job. Because people come in there, he says, for practically anything, any reason except the real one. So you've got flashers who come in here, you've got transvestites coming in here, you've got buggers and sodomites of all kinds coming in here, people fleeing the police. When someone comes in for a good, honest shit, it's like a breath of fresh air. And you knew what he wanted to say. And I'm always trying to help people finish these sentences. And I remember very vividly staying at the old Mayflower Hotel in New York during the 1992 Democratic Convention, which was a huge fiesta of euphemism and drivel. And it was very nice to be woken up quite early in the morning and hear the almost hypnotically soothing and reassuring tones of Philip Adams. I think you know what I'm talking about. And he said, well, Christopher, can you just update us on the status of things here? Would you say, for example, that as we seem to be understanding that the Ross Perot campaign is now going down the gurgler? And I thought you wouldn't get that on the BBC. You wouldn't get that on BBC. They'd have found a less flowery but much less accurate way of putting it. And it enabled me to say, actually, in my view, the Ross Perot campaign originated in the gurgler and may well be returning to whence it came. As I say about the Tea Party movement now, and all similar populist movements, what it proves is all politics is yokel. Well, the other thing to say is that the stakes, as you both mentioned, both my predecessor speakers mentioned, are quite high. Polluting the world of language is a threat to democracy, a very direct one, and you can very often tell it by the sinister intentions of those who want to promote what the French used to call the langue du bois, the wooden tongue. There's a fully expressed intention of lying, if not obfuscating, flat-out lying when this happens. Claude Cockburn, a heroic figure of British radical journalism, needed to live as long as he did to make up for the time he spent in the Communist Party in the 1930s working on the Daily Worker, where he was one day idly scanning a communique they planned to reprint from Moscow, instructing the party on how to proceed, where he came across the sentence, the imperative injunction that the leading organs of the party must penetrate the backward parts of the proletariat. And when he said to the comrades, look, I'm not sure this is going to fly in Doncaster, Glasgow and other places where they sing, he said, no, but it's from Moscow, we've got to print it. And George Orwell, who I was glad you mentioned, was very vigilant about this in his work on politics in the English language and thought there was a real relationship, important, intimate relationship between language, truth, and logic. And you can notice when people have completely decoupled language from its meaning, and it's often to do with mixture of metaphor, so that again from Pravda or Tass you would hear the jackboot has been thrown into the melting pot. The fascist octopus has sung its swan song. And things of this kind, where it was perfectly clear that it was just quacking now, barking. And that's the origin of Newspeak. I'm going to come back to Newspeak. I'm going to end on it if I'm allowed to get that far. W.H. Auden made the same intuitive connection in 1968 when the armies of the Warsaw Pact occupied Czechoslovakia. He wrote a very short poem from just across the border in Kirkstetten in Austria because he saw the propaganda that had been used to justify this atrocity. It's a provocation against the existence of the Czechoslovak regime was a provocation against the Soviet Union. Those who thought otherwise were banging the drum for the Cold War. All of these terrible langue du bois expressions. And he wrote a short poem. It's called August 1968, and it goes like this. The ogre does what ogres can. Deeds quite impossible for man. But one prize is beyond his reach. The ogre cannot master speech. About a subjugated plain, amid the terrorized and the slain, the ogre stalks with hands on hips, while drivel gushes from his lips. It was the perfect encapsulation of the langue du bois and its relationship to aggression and totalitarianism. And it's better than an irony of history, it's a real vindication. That only 21 years later, The Czechoslovak people freed themselves from this regime without anyone losing even a fingernail, without a shot being fired, in a movement led by poets and dramatists and essayists and ironists who simply by folding their arms and mocking the system made it go away like the Kingdom of Oz. This is the high stakes that we play for. This is why it is funny, but it's also very serious. Now, before I finish, because I know I'm the one who's sitting actually between you and the panel, I think there are some other things we ought to be very strongly aware of. The worst is euphemism, I suppose. Again, Orwell was very tight on this and very hard. Euphemism, in other words, the invention of pretty words for nasty things. Sometimes we win a round or two here. I don't think any politician would any longer describe civilian casualties as collateral damage. They used to. I don't think they would dare to do that now. I think we won that one. But what is currently annoying me the most is the use of the word abuse to describe the rape and torture and molestation of underage children. It's not abuse. Abuse is what I do to Johnny Walker Black Label. It's a victimless crime to some extent. Looking for an easy and excusing word for rape and torture and molestation of children is itself a crime, and actually abets the crime, and makes it seem as if there's no case to answer except that of sin and repentance instead of what is really necessary now, which is law and, most important word of all, justice. So let's have no more of that. And let's have our press stop using this crummy word to describe this terrible situation. I think that the reporting of poll data as if it was news, newspapers, when they can't be bothered to research anything or do any work, commission an opinion poll and then report its findings as if it was front-page news already by itself. That's bad, and it leads to crummy expressions like approval rating. Why do we allow a word like approval rating to circulate? I remember seeing a poll in the Los Angeles Times at the moment when Ronald Reagan had, you may remember this, a cancerous polyp in his bottom. Up his ass, to be exact. I mean, let's not be... Well, the readers of the Los Angeles Times were invited to, in an opinion poll, to say, did they think that this polyp would, A, be safely surgically removed, B, would come back, or C, would go into remission? So everyone was consulted as if they were experts on the state of affairs in the president's rear end. This is stupid, and the poll data language of consensus that goes with it, I think, is very stupid too. And it's a substitute for news. It's a substitute for research, for reporting, for analysis. It's junk and needs to be denounced as such. The word radical to me is a precious word. It has a very honorable history in the Romantic movement of the 19th century and in many movements associated with it. I think it's worth preserving. I don't want to hear that the scrofulous cleric, Mr. al-Laki in Yemen, is a radical cleric when he's talking about a return to the Middle Ages, doing without the services and talents of all women, talking about the torture and killing of homosexuals and the random infliction of violence on civilians. He should be called the reactionary cleric, al-Laki, not the radical one. It robs the language of a word if we carry on in this way. The word community pisses me off. Who isn't in a community now? It's particularly bad in my adopted country and in my hometown of Washington, D.C. There's the defense community, all right, if you must. The intelligence community for the CIA is an outrage. The donor community for those who seek to influence politics by giving money under the table is appalling. And the ultimate reductio ad absurdum of it, I did actually once read in a very guardedly written account of organized crime, the Sicilian business community. You hear the word community, keep your hand on your wallet. Tragedy is another word that I think one cannot function without, and is a word of which the language must not be robbed. There are two definitions of tragedy. One is the Hegelian one. I think this is the most acute. The tragedy is when two rights come into conflict. when there's an apparently irreconcilable combat between two rights. That's a tragic situation. And there's the Greek one, the Sophoclean, the Euripidean one of tragedy being the fatal flaw in a great person, the one that will undo him, that will set his purposes at naught. These are important considerations. They're morally important, and they're dramatically important. They're aesthetically important. Tragedy is not when disco-going princess has a traffic accident. That's not tragedy. It may be an unhappy business, but it's not tragedy. And the use of vicarious identification, in other words, wearing green ribbons about people or yellow ones, but people we don't know, a waste of feeling, a waste of emotion on vicarious identification, is another sickly, euphemistic seduction into which the media continually lure us. Well, I've got some other examples too, but we'll save all that for the time when it's your turn. I just would close with Orwell as well. If you finish 1984, when you finished it, you'll find that there's an appendix by the author. It's called A Dictionary of Newspeak. It's only a few pages, but the idea of Newspeak is to make certain thoughts unutterable, especially any thoughts of freedom, so there will be no word for it. So it isn't that certain thoughts or opinions would be banned, is that they could not in language, in English, be formulated. And for a counterexample, Orwell cites a sentence that couldn't be rendered into Newspeak, for which there could be no Newspeak translation. And it goes like this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, and so on. Well, long may that remain untranslatable into any long Dubois, and let us all strive to stand by not just the language, but the freedom, the democracy, the aspiration, the beauty, and the dignity to which we are entitled as a birthright. Thank you.
Something that you talked about, Nathan, which was authenticity and the need to be authentic. I often feel rather depressed when I watch an interview like Kerry O'Brien on the 7:30 Report, and it becomes a game. It becomes a kind of a carefully framed question to try and trap out a politician. And so that to be safe, and you mentioned risk-free, that's what generates this kind of language. And in the end, I think, well, I've just listened for that for 10 minutes and it really generated nothing of value for public debate. And I guess I'd like to ask both, all three of you, if you have a comment on it, what can we do to try and cut through that, to actually get more authenticity in that exchange so that we can have a more open and democratic discussion?
Yeah, look, I think one of the problems with the news cycle speeding up as insanely as it currently is that we now have silence all the time that has to be filled with something, and whether it's polls that are commissioned and then reported upon, or whether it's constant doorstops. I mean, as Premier, I guess you were doing it one a day. Tony Blair, at the end of his term, gave quite a fascinating, aggressive, a bit hypocritical speech about the media, where he talked about the savagery of the media. He talked about the media being like a feral beast, destroying everything in its path. Now, I think it's a tiny bit tricky coming from Tony Blair, a man who early in his term entered the North Island peace talks and said, "This is not a time for sound bites. I feel the hand of history upon my shoulder." So, fair go, but shake of the sauce bottle or whatever. Well, that's the thing. It's actually supposed to be sucked, as Martin Amos wrote to attempt so little by way of expression and still to fuck that up. But it's a problem of needing to generate matter and content. And I think that because we see our politicians all the time, we're constantly checking in on them. we don't let them have time to reflect, to develop an opinion, or even to change their mind on something. I mean, that's something that I think is a bit wrong with the way we work.
So is the answer to be less available, or to give them time, change the formats of the interviewing and the television and the radio that they do?
I just don't think that's
You can try that, and it'll be reported as missing in action. One of the fundamental differences in the way we approach language, if you're a journo or a politician, is we have to provide a response on the spot. We don't get the chance to recraft a sentence, although you'd like to in your speeches and so on sometimes. But that means that there's an immediacy to it that you will not always know the answer to the question. You will not always remember that you did something 6 months ago or made a remark 6 months ago that may now be dissonant. And that's just part of the gig. As annoying as it is when you get hung up on it, that's just part of the gig. I don't know a way around it other than when you do make an error, front up, say, listen, I got that wrong. Here are the circumstances in which I got it wrong, and that's why. But this is the case now. Now, you'll be smashed for that, but it's probably better to do that than over time be denying or prosecuting the notion that you're infallible. It's just nonsense.
I would start with my own profession, which I think is almost the most culpable. I'll give you an example. Oddly, it comes from the same election that Philip Adams called me about at that time. It was 92. George Bush was the President of the United States, and the Republican nomination for the governorship of Louisiana had been won by a man called David Duke, who some of you may remember, who was a former head of the Ku Klux Klan and of the American Nazi Party. So the President was asked at a press conference in the White House, in the Executive Mansion itself, how do you feel about the flag of your party being carried in a major state by a Nazi and a Klansman? And his reply was, I can always quote it from memory, he said, well, I'd like to be positioned where I can be perceived as having been distanced from that. and everybody wrote that down loyally because, okay, we can check that box, that's the right answer. He should be perceived as being distanced from this. And he gave but he didn't do anything actually to earn the perception or the distancing or the positioning, but it was the right answer, so it got written down. Okay, that was fine. Didn't have to prove any more. This is terrible. John Carey is somewhere in Sydney now. I don't know if any of you have been to any of his panels. He wrote a wonderful introduction to an anthology of journalism for the OUP about 25 years ago, where he said, the cliche is waiting inside the typewriter, or we would now say the keyboard. It's waiting there. Cliches, as you know, should be avoided like the plague. They're always lurking, and they're in the keyboard, and the journalist's fingers touch the keyboard, and the cliche, sensing this, goes into the fingers and then up the arms, into the brain, and then down onto the page. It's there. So you find you've written that the man who not only married the most beautiful woman in the world, but also won the Nobel Prize and the Pulitzer in the same year had no mean achievement. It's written itself for you. It was already there, waiting. And so you can become perceived as having distanced yourself from. This is it's not even thinking badly. It's refusing to think at all. That's the problem. And I think my profession is the one that's most responsible for it.
Of course, Orwell used that metaphor of the prefabricated henhouse, that you use words and you don't think about, or as Annabelle was saying, they could be constructed in any order. Yes. You just let them do the thinking for you.
The future lies before us, the past behind. We must light the torch of knowledge at the fountain of wisdom. It writes itself.
Or that Australian classic, we've got to get the status quo back to the way it was before. Now, we should go to your questions. Over on the right here, please. Yes.
I'm a journalist, and one of the most frustrating things I experience is when I have an article published, such as one that was printed yesterday, my editor will make changes to it that sort of soften some of the language. So, for example, yesterday I wrote about homophobia and mentioned the Westboro Baptist Church in America who have banners saying God hates fags and AIDS cures fags. And I used those examples in the article, but the editor changed it to anti-gay banners. So I guess my question to you is, do you think at all there is a space in the media for dumbing down language or for softening language? Like, for example, with swear words, if we're quoting someone, let's say it's the word shit, they'll put S asterisk asterisk asterisk, when we all know what the word is, so why don't we just write it? So that's my question to you. Is there a place for the softening and the dumbing down of language? Because I don't feel there is, but I'm keen to hear your thoughts.
Perhaps Christopher Annabelle?
That reminds me, we were just discussing what I consider to be the most evil and brilliant put down of a sub-editor, and please, I don't associate myself with this sentiment because my sub-editors always save me from hideous debacles, but Clive James is reputed to have, in the correspondence with a sub-editor, used the line, listen, if I wrote like that, I'd be you, which is...
Keep that one burnished and by you.
But this is how language gets the edges knocked off it or gets banged out of shape, isn't it? It passes through a succession of people, each of whom think that their own understanding of what is appropriate language is superior to his or her predecessor, I suppose. And that's what you've been a victim of yesterday. Good luck with your next piece for that publication. But it's that sort of running interference that alters language, and when it's undertaken by great numbers of people, that's when language itself changes. It's not always a bad thing; just can be quite a spooky thing. Your thoughts?
Well, it's the same problem as of euphemism. People thinking that if they could find a way of softening the blow, in other words, you're not crippled, you're physically challenged, for example, or you're no longer a Negro, but you're an African American. And I actually do know of a sub-editor who changed a headline, and it was in a Boston paper saying, "State budget back in the African American." Because all he knew was there were certain things not to do, and he doggedly did what the style book said. What's going to happen there is actually a rather cruel outcome. The words physically challenged will become sarcastic. They will themselves become the thing you can't say, because that's the way of being nasty about someone who's a gimp or a crip. But the wish to do this, to bring this about, it has to do with the combat between the Colosseum of the superego and the wish to censor ourselves and to euphemize things is very deep in us all. And it needs to be looked into individually and then very carefully rooted out.
And question over here.
I think the goal of political speech, political language, should be to simplify without being simplistic. But that's very difficult in the days of the 5-second sound grab and 140-character limit on Twitter. I think Keating said it best when he said that if Abraham Lincoln made the Gettysburg Address today, it wouldn't be reported in full. The journalists would wait for the doorstop and take a one-liner from it. The question really is, how do you explain something like an emissions trading scheme or foreign policy of Australia for the next 20 years when our attention span has been so reduced by the use of things like Twitter, emails, text messages, all of these devices that really, if not dumb us down, at least curtail the use of good language.
You might direct that one to
Yes.
Nathan, your experience of explaining complexity.
Actually, that's a comment, isn't it? Not a question. And a very good one.
But it's that is probably the great difficulty in modern political life, how you have a sensible policy debate, often about something complex. We've just had probably the most far-reaching debate on health reform that I can recall. I'm 42. I don't recall the debates around Medicare or Medibank as it was in in the 70s. But the paradox is that there is more information out there than ever before for people to access if they are interested in the policy area. But you take health reform, the takeout from that is lots of money and a change to governance structures. Now, beneath those two key outcomes or key shifts, I don't know precisely what's going to happen at state level that's going to help you get your knee fixed or your hip fixed later on. I don't know. and I suspect most people don't. We rely on engendering interest in a policy area, pointing people to a website often and saying this is where all the information is that you're going to need. And it's, people have thousands of messages bombarding them each day. You all know that. The working families know it particularly well. They've got the rearer family, pay the rent, pay the mortgage, and at some point, when they get a bit of spare time, take an interest in these things that we all think matter. Well, that's hard.
It seems to me that, I guess, once upon a time, if you read something that was written, it used to be somebody's very carefully considered thoughts, whereas now there's an immediacy for just about everybody. This is not just a case of perhaps CEOs or politicians or whatever publishing or having their thoughts or policies made known, but just everybody in the general community is able to express the first thing that comes into their head anywhere, anytime. And not just in the public realm, but just, I guess, just generally, and this might be a question that perhaps a professor of linguistics may be able to best answer, is playing English amongst the community getting worse, and is technology partly responsible for that?
It might be interesting to throw that to Annabelle, because you're one of the early adopters of Twitter in your Twitter cast from Parliament. What are your thoughts about technology and the use of social media like Twitter?
Well, I'm all for it because it allows you to talk to an audience of people who self-select themselves as being interested in what you're saying. I mean, I think that's the great advantage of Twitter for journalists, and political journalists in particular. You know that you're not boring a general audience, But, there's different types of writing and different types of communication, I think. I think that political language, political oratory in particular, needs to have an enormous amount of work put into it. It shouldn't be lazy speech. It shouldn't be just cliches that you grab out of the air. I mean, a proper speech that creates a shortcut to a political end, a proper speech that changes people's minds or makes them consider something in a new light, has to have an enormous amount of work put into it. And a finished piece of writing is like that too. And I think that it's worth remembering the difference between off-the-cuff kind of communications, such as those that are encouraged by Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and your ability to be acquainted with exactly the kind of donut that your friend in San Francisco is presently enjoying or whatever. But a proper piece of writing, a proper enterprise that is going to change minds or make people think is a real piece of work, and I think we need to remember that.
Can I just add to that? I mean, that's true, and I'm happy to admit that I've used speechwriters. Because the reality is that if you're trying to write a good speech, I would work on a factor of 10 to 1. For every hour that you're going to speak, it's going to take you 10 hours to put the speech together. You've got speechwriters. For the most important speeches, you take a very heavy hand in it yourself, and in fact, you write much of it. But you are literally sometimes delivering 10 speeches a day. You don't physically have the time to write the speeches, so you have to rely on that sort of resource.
It was interesting that you mentioned party leaderships and politicians and CEOs in the same breath, I think, because another means by which this weed has spread so far and entrenched itself so well is by the idea that the coverage of politics is to do with branding and rebranding. For some reason, we all accept that as we do rollouts. So suppose I was to be having dinner with one of you. You wish. And it would be like this. I'd say, well, try this. Can I pour you some of that? And bewitch you with a few limericks. Things. Then I interrupt myself to say, by the way, I've been striving to make a good impression on you all evening. Would you mind telling me now if this is working or not? Because if it isn't, I'll have to try some other bloody tactic. You would think you were having dinner with a psycho. But with the party leadership abetted by the media, they keep saying, well, how is the rebranding going, Mr. Cameron? Do you think you've succeeded in presenting yourself as less of a toff and more of a man of the people or not? So that's a very good question. I was going to ask you how well I was doing in that precise way. This is cretinism. And it's very, very, very widespread. And it's borrowed from a business model that is consciously designed to deceive and indeed to rob people. And it's accepted as if it was as natural as breathing. And again, I hold my own profession the most culpable in this. Politicians can't be blamed if we are at their feet and at their disposal in that way. Rebranding, forsooth.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. And I'm sure we could go for at least another hour, hour and a half, and keep kicking this around. But as we started with a quote from Kevin Rudd, we may as well finish with a quote from Kevin Rudd.
Oh, no, I've got one.
Okay.
Does anyone here remember Jimmy Hoffa, the head of the Teamsters Union? They're still looking for him. He went away a long time ago. He was taken for a ride by the Sicilian business community. And it is believed that his last resting place is in the span of an arch of a freeway in the central New Jersey area. And his son, young James, ran for the leadership of the Teamsters Union a few years ago and looked likely to win. And he was asked at a press conference what his hopes and ambitions were. And he said, "I'd like to follow in my father's footsteps."
And on that note, will you please thank our panellists, Nathan Rees, Annabelle Crabb, and Chris Hitchens.